Today we have the unique privilege to hear from someone who knows Del Noce's works better than probably any other living soul in the world today. Carlo Lancellotti is a translator of the first English translation from the original Italian of Augusto Del Noce's works, including The Crisis of Modernity and The Age of Secularization. Carlo teaches mathematics at the College of Staten Island and physics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. A native of Milan, Italy, and I actually made a mistake when I was talking about our meal. Our meal was actually from Del Noce's hometown, and maybe not from Milan, but he enjoyed the meal anyway. He holds degrees in physics, applied mathematics, including a PhD from the University of Virginia. If you thought today's reading was tough, you should read what he said about gases and plasmas, but we'll save that for another time. Dr. Lancellotti is joined for today's conversation by Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, a friend of Biola's, a friend of ours. He directs the medical ethics program at UC Irvine. He holds a degree in philosophy from Notre Dame and his MD from Georgetown, with completed his residency in psychiatry at UC Irvine. I was introduced several years ago to Dr. Kheriaty's brilliant writing on timely topics such as euthanasia and sexuality within the fields of social sciences, bioethics, and religion, offering important criticism of the new dignity approach that is taking hold within institutions of the West. Published widely in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, Public Discourse, First Things, Dr. Kheriaty is also Senior Fellow and Director of the Program in Health and Human Flourishing at the Zephyr Institute in Palo Alto and the Paul Ramsey Institute in San Francisco. So after our guests come here and engage in a dialogue with us, we'll have time of interaction with the faculty, with our own Dr. Rick Langer, professor at Talbot School of Theology and director of the Office of Faith and Learning, who will facilitate the conversation. So please now join me in welcoming Dr. Carlo Lancellotti and Dr. Aaron Kheriaty.
So, thank you, Barry, for that very welcoming and kind introduction. So, Del Noce, 1910 to 1989. Do I have those dates right? I think in the course of this conversation, we can get into maybe a little bit here and there about his biography, but I thought it would be helpful just to dive right into some of his thought. And as you read Del Noce, it's sometimes difficult to know exactly how to find your way into his thought, because he didn't write necessarily systematically, and he covered so many different themes that are sort of bound up with one another, but and you can almost sort of start anywhere and start pulling on the thread and eventually get to the other themes. But one of the really impressive things that struck me, and apparently as we were talking at lunch, also struck you when you first encountered Del Noce, is this uncanny predictive power that his thought seemed to have. Back in the 1960s, when Soviet communism was at the height of its power, Del Noce predicted its downfall. In the early 1970s, when this was on no one's radar screen, he was talking about the fact that gay marriage would be introduced before long in our culture. So, Carlo, what was it about Del Noce's thought and work that allowed him to sort of see so far ahead, down the horizon, and anticipate developments that we're now living with 30, 40, 50 years ago?
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for the invitation, for Barry and Howard for having me. It's a pleasure. Yeah, that's a very good question, because that's in fact one of the reasons I translated Del Noce, is because he had this really ability to predict the evolution of the culture. In my opinion, the crucial factor was that he really believed that people are ultimately motivated by ideas. You know, that human beings deep down are religious, but religious not necessarily in a specific sense of one doctrine or one church, but religious in the sense of they need a meaning in life. And so all of human actions are kind of motivated by this quest for meaning. And so Del Noce thought that ideas have power, that the choices that people make in history is not just shaped by sociology, psychology, economics, all the kind of material factors, but that really history is also shaped by how people understand their relationship with God. Okay, so it says this somewhere in the book that he makes fun of people who think that you can understand history apart from people's relationship with God. I mean, he thought, relationship with God, how do you understand yourself? What do you understand you to be? What do you understand a human being to be? What do you understand God to be, right? Del Noce thought that these things really have a power of causality, right? They're not just like in Marxism, a superstructure. You know, Marxists think that really ideas are just a byproduct of economics, for example. No, Del Noce thinks that ideas move people's lives and history, and especially religious ideas. Now, I say this because Del Noce lived in a time where most people were totally excited about the human sciences. You know that in this country, after the Second World War, there was a big boom in the human sciences, for instance. And so, for instance, if you read the secularization hypothesis, have you heard of that? That was a...
Secularization is sort of an inevitable feature of
It's an inevitable feature, but it's inevitable because it's the result of affluence and, you know, a technical and scientific expansion. And so you can do a study and discover that when society is industrialized and become technically advanced, then they secularize. This is what Del Noce would call a sociologistic kind of argument, right? That people's religious views follow from what the economy is doing, what society is doing. And he thought that this was inadequate. It was very countercultural in the sense that he really felt that if you want to understand where things are going, you have to try to understand what people are thinking about themselves, God, and all the fundamental metaphysical questions. So these kind of surprising predictions he made are because he really took seriously the question of what are people in the culture thinking, right? What ideas are shaping our culture? Because then if you are able to identify the ideas that deep down shape our culture, you can extrapolate in the future and say, well, for this follows that, from this follows this other thing. There was he quote, last thing to say about this topic, he has a beautiful quote by Jules Sand, the French philosopher who wrote that, you know, when you are a thinker, and to Del Noce we're all thinkers, okay? But say even an academic philosopher, you're free to choose your postulate. But after you choose your postulate, you're no longer free because your ideas will take you where they need to go, right? And so you have this sense that if you follow the logic of ideas, you will probably see where things are going.
So he was able to drill down and notice or find the premises that were sort of operating under the surface. Right. And even if people hadn't yet taken those assumptions or those premises to their logical conclusion,
exactly.
he knew what that logical conclusion was going to be, and
yeah.
somehow that they would play out inevitably. And he also apparently thought that people signaled what they were thinking in all kinds of subtle ways, and almost sort of every human action, even those that seem insignificant,
yeah.
tell us something about the person. Sort of the metaphysics of the miniskirt, right? What does a person who wears this think about themselves and about the world?
Yeah, that's an excellent example because Del Noce was a big critic of the sexual revolution. But you see, his approach to the sexual revolution is not primarily moral. Okay, I mean, there are different ways you can analyze the sexual revolution. One could be as a moral decay. At some point, there was a mass decline in standards of sexual morality. But why? Okay, that's not much of an explanation. Then there could be a sociological explanation. You know, women entered the workforce, and the people became richer, and the pill was discovered, right? And there goes the sexual revolution. That's a sociological explanation. Del Noce was not against the moral critique. He was not against the sociological explanation. But he also felt that the sexual revolution was a reflection of certain philosophical ideas. In particular, a certain vision of what it means to be a human being, right? And he set up this contrast between the Christian Platonic image of, when the Genesis said that God is made in the image of God, so the sense that human beings participate in a divine image, participate in some kind of cosmic order in which sexuality is inserted, and so sexuality has a symbolic value, right? It's not just an extrapolation of biology, but it reflects, for a Christian could be the Christ and the church, but for other cultures, even in Hinduism or in other religions, sexuality has some symbolic, metaphorical, typological sense. Instead, if you are a vision of human beings is just a highly evolved animal, and in which human beings don't participate in any metaphysical order, and human beings don't participate in any universal logos, like the logos of Plato, for example, then nothing is a symbol. Nothing as a symbolic reference. So what's left of sexuality? Sexuality is just the brute facts of your instincts, of your orientations, of your attractions, of your whatever. Whatever science can measure and quantify becomes the definition of sexuality. So to him, the sexual revolution can only be understood in the sense of this radical detachment of sexuality from this metaphysical context. And it's what we call positivism. Positivism is this philosophical school from the 19th century that says that everything that exists are brute facts that science can study. There is only brute facts. There is no question of meaning, right? And if you remove the question of meaning, sexuality reduced to brute facts, everything goes. You have the ethics of consent. That's all is left, right? Because there is no other criterion. So to him, for example, the sexual revolution has to be understood in this philosophical context, that after World War II, European and also American culture took a radical turn towards scientism. Scientism, the idea that only science, only scientific truth are truth. And so from the point of view of science, the truth of sexuality is what Freud and Reich and Kinsey, the sexologists of the 50s, the Kinsey report, that was an example of a scientific approach to sexuality, right? Kinsey went out and interviewed people. Are you attracted to men? Are you attracted to women? 49%, 51%, you do the percentages, but the symbolic metaphorical question is eliminated a priori by the scientific approach, and then you cannot even raise the question of morality. But the question of morality is a consequence of this kind of philosophical.
And scientism is not science. Scientism is an ideology that says the only thing that's knowable are those empirically verifiable, sort of bare, brute facts, right? So scientism is a metaphysical presupposition that excludes other forms of knowledge, religious knowledge, philosophical knowledge,
that's exactly
outside of that kind of narrow positivism that it stands on. And so it seems like that eroticism or the sexual revolution is sort of the ethics that naturally follows from scientism. Is that
absolutely.
Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that when he talks about the sexual revolution, Del Noce refers to this kind of wacky psychiatrist called Wilhelm Reich. He was an immigrant from Austria, and he came to America, and he was put in jail for
weird behavior, let's say.
Yeah, weird behavior.
But that was still considered weird back in, the 1950s?
Yeah, he died in 1957 in a jail in Ohio, I believe. But anyway, Reich, even if he was a quack in many ways, Reich has this machine, I think it was called the orgasmotron or something like that.
Yeah,
he was trying to focus the universal energy in this machine that would help pleasure in some sense, right? He had this idea, but you see, if you look at Reich...
But it goes... Del Noce took his thought seriously.
Yes, he took it seriously, not because he thought he was a good philosopher, but because he thought it was a representative philosopher, okay? It's different to be a good philosopher or to be a representative philosopher. He thought that Reich was representative because, first of all, Reich wrote a book called The Sexual Revolution. Back in
1930?
1930, yes. Which I always like to say that Del Noce says it was the Mein Kampf of the sexual revolution.
Which didn't start in 1968. You could find everything
no, the
there
Noce
in
says that the Czech
1930.
Revolution took off in the 1920s in Europe, right? Because in the 1920s in Europe, it was the Roaring Twenties are called, and I think that the Roaring Twenties were probably kind of libertine even in the United States to some extent. But in Europe, the Roaring Twenties were really when people started questioning authority in a radical way, right? After the Soviet Revolution, people thought that the revolution was going to sweep the world, and in the West, it would require questioning authority. So already in the 20s, these ideas were circulating. And so Reich wrote this book, and the reason Del Noce thinks is representative, not good, but representative, is because Reich merges these two things. A completely scientific approach to sex, right? That sex has to be determined just by scientific criteria, and a translation of Marxism into sexual terms. And this is more complicated. Reich says that, that Marx has this idea that religion exists because there is still capitalism and oppression, and then when we remove capitalism after the revolution, people will be so happy they will not need religion. They will not.
We don't need the opiate of the masses anymore because they're living in a communist utopia.
Right. So for Marx, the reason for religion was economic oppression. People believed in God because they were economically oppressed. Now, what Reich did, he took Marx and changed economically oppressed into sexually repressed. And so he said, people believe in God because they're sexually repressed. If we make them sexually happy, he says this, there is a beautiful quote I always use, he says, if we use the natural sciences, scientism, and people then will be happy, sexually happy, use the adverb sexually. When people achieve sexual happiness through the application of the natural sciences, the religious problems will disappear. Okay? You see that this is a Marxist idea. It's a Marxist idea which has been transmogrified from economics into sexuality, but it's still the Marxist idea, right? And so the combination of scientism and sexualized Marxism to Del Noce is the philosophical premise of the sexual revolution.
So Del Noce thought that Marx's philosophy, maybe not so much his economics, but his philosophy was one of the most important protagonists of the 20th century, and not just for Soviet communism, but he also thought that Marxism continued to influence the West after World War II, and which seems sort of paradoxical because we have the Cold War, right? They're over there, they're quote unquote Marxists, and we're resisting the expansion of Soviet communism. So we must be anti-Marxist. But Del Noce paradoxically says, no, both sides of this conflict at the second half of the 20th century were deeply influenced by Marx. Can you explain why Del Noce thinks Marx was so important and so influential in this way that I think would be surprising to a lot of us?
Yeah, that's a good question that people always ask because, in this country, people think correctly that Marxists did not have the same political impact that in Europe, right? Communism was never a big deal in this country. In fact, it was the enemy during the Cold War. And to some extent, it's true that if you follow the trajectory of secularization in this country, there are some differences, the way secularization progressed in the US from Europe. Having said that, Aaron is exactly right that Del Noce thinks that Marx has a universal relevance to modern atheism, which goes beyond communism. Okay, so Del Noce is not very interested in Marxism as the source of communism as a political movement. He's more interested in Marx as a philosopher, and to him, Marx is kind of as some of the core key ideas of modern atheism that, in some sense, they can pop up independently of Marx himself, right? You don't need to read Marx, right? But if you follow, again, a certain logic of modern rationalism, Del Noce says, even if you don't want it, you will discover some of the things that Marx came up with, right? So there is something, again, built in the logic of ideas. To him, Marxist philosophy, first of all, Del Noce really liked the young books by Marx. Marx in 1844 wrote a book called the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, in which he spells out the program of his philosophy, and saying that he says that a man is not free if somebody else creates him. Okay, this is a paraphrase. Okay, he says if you are dependent, he says freedom requires radical independence. If you are dependent, you are not free. If you are dependent on somebody who makes you, like the creator God, you are totally not free. Okay, so in Marx there is this idea that freedom requires radical independence. Independence, first of all, from God, because to Marx, God is the archetype of the Lord, of the Lord with a little L, in the sense of the
feudal Lord.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So to him, this idea of radical independence continues in history, and then you can stop me if you want. I make one more.
No, I mean, we see this meme in our culture, right?
Yeah,
that somehow dependence upon God is an imposition upon my autonomy, or that God's freedom and my freedom can't coexist or coincide. And so Del Noce would say sort of this idea of needing to break from any notion of dependence was at the core of Marxist philosophy, and it seems pretty obvious, at least to me, that notion continues to be enormously influential in the culture.
And then it has consequences, because the idea, of course, we cannot create ourselves individually. Okay, obviously everybody was born from our mother, but what Marx then affirms is this idea of social self-creation, so to speak, right? That human beings create themselves through their work, through their construction of the world economically. And the big tool that makes possible this is science and technology. Okay, when Marx talks about the advent of the reign of freedom, in which there will be a classless society and capitalism will be overcome, the way this is going to happen after the revolution certainly requires a big expansion of science. In fact, there was a famous French author, Sorel, who writes that really Marx was deeply scientific himself in his own way, right? But the interesting thing, though, is that in Marx, this affirmation of independence then requires what Del Noce calls a atheification of rationality. Okay, this is, by the way, a mouthful, okay? But
see if you can keep up here.
Right. What it means is that, the traditional Christian idea of rationality is that we participate in God's reason, the Logos, right? We participate in the Logos of God, in the Holy Spirit, and you can put it in many different ways. So reason is not just instrumental. According to the traditional idea, reason is contemplative. We contemplate the beauty of creation, we contemplate God's revelation, we contemplate. It's about knowledge, okay?
And this allows us to come to know the world.
Exactly. Because
it's intelligible, because the world also participates in the Logos, divine reason, and it allows us to dialogue with one another, because reason is universal, and so we can have an argument or debate with the intent of trying to pursue the truth together in some sort of meaningful project. Whereas Marx really undermined this.
Marx, in order to cut off this dependence, the boogie-woo, the bad word for Marx is dependence. In order to cut off this dependence of God, affirms that reason does not contemplate any truth, because in a sense we make the truth with our own hands, right? We are the creators of the world. So knowledge and rationality become instrumental. And this is the word that Del Noce uses. That rationality is no longer contemplative, but strictly instrumental. It's about manipulating reality to make it in our own image, to shape it in our own image. Now,
gender, my body is whatever I want it to be, whatever I create it to be, as one example among many that we could mention today.
Yes, that would fit. Now, of course, this aspect in Marx is mixed up with other things. There is all this revolutionary hope, there is this big romantic aspect in Marx. However, what Del Noce recognized already in the 50s is that if the revolution falls to the wayside, it doesn't work, if you eliminate the revolutionary, romantic, communist aspect of Marxism,
Sort of the religious aspect,
which is actually a
sense.
kind of a secular religious aspect
Right.
of Marxism. What's left is radical scientism, instrumentalism of knowledge, an affirmation of independence, radical atheism, radical relativism, right? Because everything becomes relative to the social circumstances. Now,
And materialism.
and materialism, right? And so he said that this half of Marxism was very successful also in the West, right? So his idea was that that Marxism had two contradictory elements. There was the revolutionary romantic aspect, and there was the materialistic relativistic aspect, and they were kind of contradictory with each other. One lost, but the other won. So if they
One here as well as on both sides of
yes,
the
and
sort of.
in fact, at some point he said that in his opinion, the revolutionary side of Marxism lost because the relativistic and materialistic side won. He even went as far as saying that Marxism was defeated in the East because it triumphed in the West, you know, which is kind of a paradoxical statement. But having said that, is referring again to the relativistic, materialistic aspect of Marxism, not to the revolution or to communism as a political movement. Having said that, one thing I like to always kind of use to scandalize my American audiences, I don't know if you ever read, there is a book by George Marsden, who is a distinguished evangelical scholar, who wrote this book called The Highlight of the American the Twilight of the American Enlightenment, probably maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. Anyway, in this book, in the first half of the book, Marsden reviews the cultural landscape of American high culture in the 1950s. And he describes how there is this prevalence of scientism, sociologism, instrumental reason, that people really hoped that technology would solve all the problems, that religion was to be made a strictly private affair because of whatever. Okay. Paradoxically, that was very much like the winning half of Marxism, right? It was not Marxist. They would not call themselves Marxist. But if you take Marxism without the revolution, it's not so different from the American infatuation with the social sciences in the 1950s and 60s.
There's a sort of utopian dream,
Right.
that not only are we going to sort of outspend and out-technologize
Exactly.
the Soviets and therefore win, but also that this is what's going to bring about human happiness, or a kind of horizontal, earthly, they wouldn't say beatitude,
Yeah, exactly.
well-being, right?
Exactly. In fact, he makes an interesting comment. He says, you know, that like in the Cold War, there were like two stages, that between 1945 and 1955, people kind of refer to Christian civilization as the opposition to communism. So they tended to interpret the Cold War as this opposition of a Christian Western civilization against the atheistic communist Russian civilization. But then he says that after 1955, he noticed that in many places in the West, people started thinking that you can beat the USSR at their own game, no? Because in a sense, communism had the promise of a prosperous society with equality, with material well-being, production. It says, we can do better than them, right? So in a sense, there was this idea that the Cold War started to be interpreted in a more secular way as beating the Soviet Union on the ground of secularity, not on the ground of opposing a religious to a non-religious worldview, but of opposing a more successful capitalistic secularity to a failing communist secularity, but still within a secular framework, you know what I mean?
But this leads to a kind of disintegration, right? Where if human beings are not participating in something transcendent or higher than ourselves, we end up being these sort of isolated, atomistic entities that are only related to one another in terms of utility. Are you useful for my ends or purposes? People are instrumentalized, not just nature or things, the natural world, but other human beings.
Yeah, another way to put it that Del Noce uses, he says that you become radically bourgeois. Now, this is a word that is a little difficult to use in the US because it means different things. But what he means by that is that the traditional view of happiness that, again, happiness implies participating in the life of God, right? So happiness is not individualistic. You're not happy by yourself. You're happy in a relationship, right? So you're happy in your relationship with God. You're happy by analogy in your relationship with other human beings, with the church, with your family, with your nation, right? So there is this network of relationships that are an integral part of your own personality. And so your own personality is not individualistic. Now, Del Noce says that what he would call the bourgeois idea of happiness is an happiness which is completely worldly. Meaning that, there is no longer, the St. Augustine, the restless heart, the human heart is never fulfilled. The human heart always needs more. And so in this sense, you're always seeking a relationship with the transcendent, as Barry was talking about. Del Noce says that in the modern world, after the French Revolution, there is the idea of bourgeois happiness as purely world. It's possible to be happy now, here in this world. If I have enough goods, I will be happy. Okay, there is nothing in me which is open-ended, right? There is not this divine image which is never satisfied. Now, this idea of bourgeois happiness is radically individualistic because you don't need to relate anymore, right? While the traditional idea of happiness implied a relationship, which was called beatitude. Beatitude was not that you are happy by yourself. Beatitude was that you are happy in the contemplation of God, right? So instead, this kind of bourgeois idea of happiness does not require any relationship, so it becomes individualized. And so in this sense, Del Noce says that it produces a non-society, non-society, meaning a place where people live together, but they don't really share an ideal. They don't share a common relationship with God. They don't share a common good in any sense. They just happen to be in the same place as what the great German philosopher of the 19th century Stirner called a union of egoists, right? In which everybody is pursuing happiness in a strictly individual sense.
Well, the people who get in the way of this kind of project then are a problem. Del Noce actually made another, I think, surprising, paradoxical claim, and that's that this project of the affluent, technocratic society, he had different names to describe where we're at, and this thing that you basically just sketched for us, that it was totalitarian, which is kind of a shocking term. Again, no, we in the West this is the free world, right? The totalitarians, we defeated them in the Second World War, and the ones that are left are over there in sort of the Soviet world. Yeah. How could he claim that that the sort of scientistic society that leads to eroticism was totalitarian? Why did he claim that there was a necessary link between eroticism, the sexual revolution, and aggressiveness?
Yes, Del Noce was a young man during the 30s, and arguably all of his life was shaped by the experience of living under fascism, and then during the war there was the Nazis and communism. And for him, what he came to recognize as the essence of totalitarianism was not so much, that you have concentration camps or you have the Gestapo or the KGB. For him, what was the essence of totalitarianism was the fact that certain questions are forbidden. There are certain things that you cannot even ask. Why? Because you are asking them because you are a Jew, or you are asking them because you are a bourgeois, right? For instance, in the Marxist propaganda would prohibit certain questions by saying, you say that to defend the interests of the bourgeoisie. Or in the Nazi Germany, if somebody had something to say, if he was a Jew, you said, you say that because you're part of the Jewish worldwide conspiracy, okay?
Abandoning the idea that the person may be searching for the truth, because we can't do that anymore if we're no longer participating in the logos.
Exactly, and so Del Noce has this kind of another mouthful. He says that the real defining characteristic of totalitarianism is to deny the universality of reason, to deny that there is a universal reason that makes it possible to talk. Because there is the reason of the communist, the rationality of the communist, and the rationality of the bourgeois. And we, the communists, have the monopoly on true rationality, and we don't talk to the bourgeois. Or the Nazis don't talk to the Jews. or we don't talk to the big gods. You know what I mean? Because
some of the people in this room.
Right. I don't know. You tell me. But you know, if you look again to the human sciences of the 1950s and 60s, like Wilhelm Reich and other people, they had this idea that certain questions are due to bigotry. Right, that everybody, you can study scientifically various matters of sexuality, but scientism is the enemy of religion, where religion is this irrational bigotry, right? And so you see that immediately Del Noce recognized that in the 50s and 60s, in this hubris of the human sciences, there was a repetition of the same phenomenon that he had seen as a young man in the 30s and 40s. That some people were excluded by conversation, by an imputation of motivation, right? Some people were excluded from the conversation by imputing them a motivation.
Bad
okay?
motives that were self-serving and
right.
not...
Those people were objecting because they're bourgeois, other people were objecting because they were Jews. You people are objecting because you're bigots. But if you are scientists like me, you will see that the science says that, okay? And so science, of course, this is not, I like to say science with a question mark, it's not general relativity, is the science of Wilhelm Reich, right? It's a claim to science. I mean, Del Noce says that in our century, all the ancient heresies have resurfaced by claiming the mantle of science, okay? When in the 4th century, you had the Arians and the Marcionites and all the heresies.
The Gnostics.
Yeah, the Gnostics. Now, the Gnostics are back, but they claim to be scientists because it feels good, right? I mean, it kind of gives you an authority if you claim to be a scientist. But nevertheless, this claim of scientists was used in a totalitarian fashion to kind of close the discussion.
I want to, before we open things up for Q&A from the audience, I want to give folks just a little flavor of Del Noce, and I thought I would just riff on this last theme. This is from a 1972 essay called The Roots of the Crisis, where he writes, "It is easy to understand the process through which permissivism can establish itself, eroticism, sexual revolution. The remaining believers in a transcendent authority of values will be marginalized and reduced to second-class citizens. They will be imprisoned, ultimately in moral concentration camps. But nobody can seriously think that moral punishments will be less severe than physical punishments." No? Social ostracism. At the end of the process lies the spiritual version of genocide. The individual will be denied the right to his environment, to his traditions, to modesty. Indeed, the total liberalization of passions as the principle of the permissive society coincides with the complete negation of modesty. This was back in 1972, and I think the trends that he saw back then have only been amplified today. This is another one of those passages that strikes me as prophetic. So maybe I'll end my portion of the conversation with, because all of this can, I think, sound a bit bleak. Where does our hope lie for Del Noce? If this is the diagnosis...
Okay, if you read the Del Noce pieces from the early 70s, it's the most pessimistic period. In the early 70s, it was really despairing. He got a great, much more hopeful in the 80s. Part of the reason is because of the new Pope. He thought that John Paul II was going to turn things around, which to some extent for Catholics he did. And also because, you know, in the 80s, I think there is a generational phenomenon that the 80s were the age in which kind of the people who have been educated in 1968 were still young. They came to power in the 90s, right? Bill Clinton was elected in 1992, for example. And so in the 80s, Del Noce was less pessimistic. But, I mean, Del Noce was a religious man, and he thought that, you know, philosophers can only do so much. Philosophers can diagnose, they can try to tell you how things are working, how the ideas are developing, where this is going, where this is coming from. He believed that at the end of the day, since ultimately it's about, again, how people understand themselves in relation with God, what's needed is some sort of religious revival. He says this somewhere, that it's not philosophy that will save the world, but that some kind of revival is needed in that sense. And he had faith in that. The only thing is that, you know, we don't know. I mean, it takes time. These things are very mysterious. But at least to understand what we face is part of our task.
He also talked about trying to remind people, or at least tap into the, I think, did he call it the religious dimension, which was not necessarily
that's a very
religion,
yes, that's
which
a very
can
important thing.
become a kind of drug in the Marxist scheme or in the contemporary scheme. You know, I go to church because it makes me feel good, or it lowers my blood pressure, or something like that. Religion can become instrumentalized.
Yeah, no, thank you, because that's something I meant to say a couple of words and I forgot. You know, Del Noce makes this very important point that to understand secularization today, you have to understand that the attack against religiosity, or against Christianity, if you want, is not primarily an attack on faith, but even before that, is an attack of the human ground in which faith sets its roots. Okay? And he calls this the religious dimension. And this is a very important point because, you know, in ages past, maybe there would be this heretic or that heretic would attack the faith, would deny the faith. To Del Noce, the characteristic of the modern world, which again is due largely to Marx and also the positivists and Comte, is that the attack is not on the religious answers, but on the religious questions. Okay? And this is very important in his opinion, because you see, Christianity is an answer. Okay? Jesus Christ presents himself as the answer to a human need, a human expectation. Human beings expect a meaning or a fulfillment or a redemption, or there are many ways you can phrase this. But Del Noce thinks that what makes the current secularization process especially damaging is that it doesn't even care about denying the faith. It cares about denying the very question to which the faith is the answer. Does it make any sense?
Right. Right. So our hearts are restless until they rest in you.
Right, but
let's suppress that
that's
longing.
again the bourgeois worldview. The bourgeois worldview suppresses the restlessness. Now, if you suppress the restlessness, Christianity doesn't make any sense anymore, because what question is it all supposed to answer?
Just plug people into a screen and
Exactly.
and feed their impulses, fulfill their whims, and then that religious dimension gets forced out of awareness.
Yes, or promise to them again bourgeois happiness. You know, you can be happy. I mean.
So let me just start with one quick thought. My introduction to Del Noce's thought came from an interview I heard with Dr. Lancellotti on a Marxist Audio Journal about 1.5 years ago, talking about this translation, and he was definitely, I was the perfect description of the person who had literally never heard of this very influential philosopher, partly because these works weren't available in English. I was intrigued as I read a little bit more at the time about the comparisons were made with him as the Italian Russell Kirk. So Russell Kirk is a renowned conservative philosopher in the United States, and apparently Lancellotti had a similar influence, and also probably most particularly the appeal to Kirk calls them the permanent things, but in very similar to the language we've been using today about transcendent things. So I was just curious both about that connection, but also part of Kirk was famous for talking about the conservative mind. And I've often wondered, what is the connection between the conservative mind, so to speak, and the Christian mind? Are they somehow closer connected than a Christian mind would be to a liberal mind? What is the connection between, in effect, the thought of Del Noce and the Christian mind, so to speak?
Or the conservative mind. Well, Del Noce, I don't think, would define himself as a conservative in the American sense, because the word conservative means many different things, but and like the word liberalism, okay, so they're very difficult to use. But Del Noce, the meaning he thinks is most appropriate for conservatives is the idea that there is this accumulated wisdom, that, you know, that wisdom accumulated during the centuries, and we better not touch things, better leave things alone, because that maximizes the odds that what we have is going to work. He was not against that, but he felt that the important thing is not just this kind of pessimist, prudential, don't rock the boat kind of conservatives, but to recognize there are eternal things, right? So, which is kind of overlaps, of course, right? But he had a sense that really the point of tradition is not just to transmit the past. The point of tradition is to transmit what the past understood, which is enduring, which is eternal, right? Which is not the same as the past per se. There could be a past which is wrong. So it's the idea that the tradition is valuable to the extent that it transmits something that people understood to have a permanent value.
And those transcendent truths need to be rediscovered in every age. It's good that we have Augustine and Aquinas and Calvin, but it's not enough just to go back and say, well, sort of they put it down in writing and there it is.
Because Thomas Aquinas never had to do with Facebook, right? I mean, every age has to face different problems. Not only the truth is eternal, but the truth is also infinite, meaning the truth has potentialities, right? In the truth, like in the gospel, the scribe that picks up new things and all things, you know. I don't know where that is.
Yes, yes.
Somewhere in the gospel. I mean, the idea is that the truth has untapped potential that can be applied to understand new situations that never were faced before, in which you can still pick up the good parts, throw out the bad parts, test everything, keep what is good, Philippians, you know, whatever. So he says that the truth is not a theory. I mean, you can take the Summa, you can take the City of God. Those are great works, but still, the revelation and in general, the human effort to understand the truth can face new situations in which you have to tap what we call the virtualities of the tradition. I mean, things that are in the tradition, but they were never really explicated because there was no need to explicate.
Yeah. Let me turn to the audience. Anyone have a question that they would like to address to, I think, really either one or both of our panelists?
Thank you very much. So I read not long ago Emmanuel Mounier's Personalist Manifesto, where there's a lot of overlapping themes. But he also talks about bourgeois mentality, bourgeois happiness, and is concerned about both Marxism and fascism as incompatible with the dignity of the person, political systems incompatible with the dignity of the person. But he also is concerned about capitalism and suggests that capitalism is really the source of the bourgeois mentality, bourgeois happiness that's so destructive to human personhood. And I don't hear that theme in Del Noce. I wonder what kind of, was there interaction between the personalist movement and Del Noce, and what did that look like?
Yeah, they were more or less contemporaries. Del Noce was a disciple of Maritain. Maritain was a French Catholic philosopher that, in a sense, also Mounier was a disciple of Maritain. Del Noce, I'm no expert, so take this with a grain of salt, but Del Noce felt that Mounier developed the weaker side of Maritain. Okay? And the weaker side to Maritain was the side in which Maritain thought that modern atheism is a justifiable response to the implicit practical atheism of the bourgeois lifestyle. And while in Del Noce's perspective, modern atheism is not just that. Modern atheism is what I said before about Marx, a radical rejection of dependence, right? Because modern atheism is this radical atheism as rejection of dependence on God, Del Noce felt that compromises with Marxism are futile on the part of a Christian. While Mounier, for all I understand, developed the side of Maritain in which atheism is really kind of a reaction to the practical hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie. And so Mounier saw a lot of possible common ground between Christian and Marxist on this anti-bourgeois position. And I think Del Noce thought that this was a delusion.
Isn't it true, though, Carlo, that Del Noce would have some critical things to say about capitalism and its current instantiation, large multinational corporations concentrating power in the hands of
as I said,
few.
Del Noce was a critic of what we call this bourgeois worldview and implicitly also of capitalism. There is no question. But the question was about the relationship with Marxism. Del Noce felt that Marxism, Del Noce thought that Marxism is doomed to prop up a more harsh capitalism. Right? Del Noce felt that Marxism does the destructive work. He kind of cleans the ground from these absolute values of this sense of transcendence. Then it fails to deliver the revolution, right? And when Marxism fails to deliver the revolution, its destructive work helps capitalism to become more pure, he says, to become a more radical form of capitalism. Because if you look at capitalism in the 19th century, capitalism in the 19th century was still very constrained by Christian moral values in a secular form, like Kant. The 19th century was the century of Kantian morality. Kantian morality was supposed to be secular for most people, but it was formally Christian, right? It still respected the idea that the other person is always an end, never a mean, all that kind of idea.
Better than Nietzschean morality.
Yeah, better than Nietzschean morality. So Del Noce thinks that Marxism is condemned to do capitalism's work. Marxism does capitalism's work by cleaning out all these symbolic, metaphysical, religious, philosophical structures with the critique of historical materialism, but then is not able to overcome capitalism, and so capitalism comes back stronger. That's his view.
I'm hoping to get this out right. I was struck by you saying that the 80s were a period of hope for him because of John Paul II, essentially. And I was really struck reading the readings we were assigned in this relationship to John Paul's writings, say like Fides et Ratio, on Faith and Reason, or The Splendor of the Truth. In Faith and Reason, he writes that pluralists of our time are mistaken when they deny the universal value of the church's philosophical heritage. And I'm wondering what you think Del Noce would have made of that statement. He gestures multiple times in the bits that we were reading toward this kind of broad Platonism. He doesn't mean necessarily the doctrine of the forms.
Absolutely.
He just means a sort of like broader
Absolutely.
spiritual fusion of the spiritual with the philosophical impulses of the human spirit. So I was curious about what you might say, or he might say about John Paul II sort of saying that actually there's this normative philosophical heritage of the church that remains something that the church has to hold on to and continue to articulate with power and precision, even as it engages with Eastern traditions and with the plurality of the modern world.
Yeah, Del Noce would agree 100%. I mean, that was his position too. Another way to put that is the question of de-Hellenization. Heard of that formula? Back in the 60s, there were people who thought that you have to separate Christianity from the old kind of classical Greek philosophical tradition, Plato, Aristotle, and for instance,
Athens has nothing to do with
Jerusalem, that kind of thing. No, Del Noce, together also, for instance, Cardinal Ratzinger, before becoming the Pope, also was a big opponent of this de-Hellenization idea. Del Noce was of the school of thought that sought, again, that Christianity found in Greek philosophy a way to articulate its truths that in some ways cannot be discarded anymore. Like, I mean, the fathers of the church articulated the creeds in terms of person, substance, nature. Those are Greek philosophical terms that you say on Sunday in the Nicene Creed. And Del Noce felt, not only for that reason, but Del Noce felt that, generally speaking, again, grace and faith, in some sense, address the deepest yearnings and the deepest question of human nature, as expressed by the great philosophers. So to try to separate philosophy and theology, or to oppose, the religious sense and faith, to him is disastrous. And that was his great criticism of what we can call Catholic progressivism. In the 60s, there was the kind of more liberal theology. And in his opinion, the big fault of liberal theology, both in its Protestant and Catholic versions, was that it tried to replace metaphysics with sociology, right? You try to keep the faith, separate theology from philosophy, kind of discard philosophy, and try to pop up religion with sociological arguments and techniques. To him, that was going to fail, and I think it did. But
Did John Paul II read Del Noce or Paul VI?
I'm sure he did. Yeah, I'm sure that he did. I cannot give you an example, but Del Noce was well known at the time, so it was certainly.
I can't help but think that if the idea that Marxism wants to do away with dependence, there's a great irony in it, the way, at least contemporarily, the autonomy works, is that I'm only autonomous when the herd is autonomous. And I'm actually now dependent on the herd for my own radical autonomy, which means then that I've taken the transcendent, which was what we were dependent on, and Del Noce would say we should be, and now I've made it dependent on the transient. So did Del Noce look forward to, it seems like to me that's an irony waiting to unravel.
Yeah.
And so what does that look like in his forward-looking thought?
Yes. You almost quoted something he wrote. He wrote that the end point of Western project of liberation is to make people completely dependent on society. So you deny the dependence on God and make them completely dependent on society. I mean, he was not the first one to point that out, by the way, but he certainly says that. I mean, as Aaron was saying, he has this, Del Noce has this other mouthful, he calls something heterogenesis of ends, which means that sometimes people, they want to achieve A, they do it based on wrong presupposition, and they achieve non-A, right? So in this case, the Marxist attempt to achieve independence achieves, as you said, complete dependence. The Marxist attempt to overthrow the bourgeoisie achieves the most bourgeois society possible, right? I mean, or the attempt of the sexual revolution to get to make people sexually blissful makes people sexually miserable, right? Okay, all this kind of inversion of outcome with respect to an incorrectly posed premise is what he calls heterogenesis of ends, right? You can go home and tell people, you know what the heterogenesis? Okay, it's kind of a strange formula he uses, right? But he quotes, last thing, he quotes another famous Italian thinker, Rosmini. Rosmini says somewhere that when human beings try to do something against God, they always end up doing the opposite of what they say.
Can I ask, you mentioned Rosmini as one of the key thinkers that he looks to for possibilities of recovery from the crisis. He also looks to the 20th century figure of Simone Weil.
Yeah, Simone Weil.
Can you tell us a little bit about her? And she never became she was never baptized, right?
Yeah,
but,
no,
and yet he thought
that's what I thought.
Her life was a way out of secularism.
A month ago told me, a friend of mine told me she was baptized on her deathbed. Oh, okay. But anyway, yeah, Simone Weil to Del Noce is the hero of the 20th century because, Simone Weil was this Jewish thinker. She came from a very, very secular Jewish French family in Paris. Her brother André went on to become a very famous Princeton math professor who died like 10 years ago. But she died young. She died in 1943 of TB because she had this radical desire to be with the poor. And so she was in England, but she wanted to eat only the same rations that the people were having in occupied France. And so she basically starved herself to death not to eat more than the people in France. Anyway, but she was not healthy to begin with. But anyway, the reason that Del Noce thinks that Simone Weil was really important is because she came from a very secular background and she rediscovered the religious dimension. She was also a Marxist for a while, but her rediscovery of Christianity ultimately was exactly by rediscovering the religious dimension. Okay? Del Noce has a beautiful comment that says that that Weil rediscovered the eternal truth not out of traditionalism but out of a revolt. Okay? Think about that. Most people sometimes rediscover eternal truth out of an attachment to tradition, but she had no tradition. She was totally uprooted from every tradition. He said instead she didn't discover the truth just by traditionalism but by a revolt, meaning that she went to the depth of the question of justice. She had a deep, ingrained, profound desire for justice. And she was not happy with the Marxist answer because she realized it was a fraud in some sense. She was not happy with capitalism, but she went to the depth of the question of justice, and at the depth of that question, she discovered that that justice lives in the human heart. Now, when you make this statement that justice is alive in the human heart, you are coming back to the restlessness. You're coming back to St. Augustine. You're coming back to the old religious dimension. The idea that the human heart is relationship with the transcendent. The human heart is openness to something else, right? And so in this way, she rediscovered the religious dimension in a radically human and experiential way, not ideological, not traditionalist, not even immediately religious. In fact, she discovered Plato before she discovered Christ. But then from Plato, she also moved on to Christ. She had a mystical experience in Assisi. But that was an extra factor.
Just wondering if Del Noce had any kind of positive vision of the kind of political order that would be most conducive to mitigating the concerns that he saw or enhancing, I don't know, the solutions that he could imagine, and if he specifically had any thoughts about American political order.
No, the second answer, it's easy, no. I mean, Del Noce never came to America, as far as I know. and he had some knowledge of the American pragmatists, and he read about America in the newspapers. He had his opinions about America. He didn't like Kennedy, for example. He thought that Kennedy was the symbol of this secular, technocratic, scientific involution of politics. But generally speaking, Del Noce was a continental European in many ways, right? And it's interesting how things went in parallel across oceans in many different ways. But he did think about politics a lot. He was, generally speaking, an exponent of what we could call the European Christian democratic tradition, right? I mean, you know, there are people like Kuiper in Holland and Sturzo in Italy, and the French school and the German Christian democratic movement. So he was part of Christian democracy. But he was, as I said, an opponent of the more Munierist, kind of philo-Marxist, partially, philo-Marxist trend. He was more of a liberal Christian democracy. However, the word liberal is completely different from the American sense of the word liberal. In continental Europe, liberalism has a more conservative sense. And the big distinction that Del Noce makes, that in his opinion is crucial for a Christian political stance, is between what he calls perfectism and anti-perfectism, which is a distinction that goes back to Rosmini, since you mentioned Rosmini. The idea is that in Del Noce view, all political position can be classified like taxonomically, like animal species, in perfectist political position and anti-perfectist political positions, where a perfectist political position assumes that progress is virtually possible without any intrinsic limit, right? That perfection is possible. It may not be achieved now, may be achieved in 100 years from now, but ultimately there is no intrinsic limit in human perfectibility. And he says, if you take this stance, in a sense, you're already on your way to totalitarianism, because if this is possible, those who stand in the way of perfection have to be
totally intolerable.
They're totally intolerable, the way of progress. While instead, from his perspective, what he calls an anti-perfectist political position, one that recognizes that the balance of good and evil in history is roughly always the same. and that generally speaking, progress does apply to science and technology, but progress in a radical sense does not apply to moral realities. The moral level, I mean, of course, this for him is grounded in the doctrine of original sin. Although it's interesting that for him there is also perfectist political doctrine based on original sin. For instance, for him, Adam Smith is a perfectist, because for him, Adam Smith thinks that the invisible hand will bring out the best in spite of original sin. So it's not enough to put original sin into the mix for him. In his opinion, you need to take an explicitly anti-perfectist stance and then work it out and see what it means.
And that doesn't lead to a pessimism about the political project, just a prudent caution?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that it shouldn't, but it could. I mean, I think it's just a matter of recognizing that ultimately what is at stake is, again, the ultimate relationship between the individual and the meaning of life. So in some sense, he makes an interesting point. He says that at the end of the day, the struggle between good and evil is settled in each individual conscience. It's not settled in the political process. Yeah. The political process will not ultimately, the political process will not ultimately settle the struggle between good and evil. And if it tries to do, it's going to have bad consequences.
So it's a realism about what the political order, the social order can ultimately do, that our salvation is not going to come from politics, it has to come from grace.
Right, exactly.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.